Hi, everybody. This is Professor Michael Jahoski, and today I am joined by my very good friend and colleague at St. Petersburg College, Dr. Matthew Sims. Now, please don't fault him for teaching at the less cool Tarpon Springs campus, whereas obviously the cooler campus is Clearwater, which is where I teach, of course. But, it's a recent move for me. I was at the Gibbs campus for quite some time. Anyway, I'm happy to have a friend on the show today and have a very exciting episode. Dr. Sims is going to talk to us about his new book, which I'm going to be telling you a little bit about here, and is a wonderful book. So I just had the title up, Matthew. Can you help me remind me the full title again?
Yes, the complete title is called Ancient Greeks on the Human Condition, Themes in the Writings of Homer, Aristophanes, Euripides, and Thucydides.
That's
That's
it.
a
Okay.
mouthful.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's looking like and I've had the privilege of reading a few snippets here and there, and it's wonderful. I can't wait for people to get their hands on it. So we're
Thank
going to
you.
be talking about this towards the end of the episode today. And I'm going to ask Dr. Sims his opinion on myth, which is something we always talk about here at Mythic Mission. And we're also going to talk about especially his Christian perspective on the Greek tragedians and what role this has in anticipating the gospel, if at all. And so we've got some great topics for you. And we're also up front, the first half hour of the show today, we're going to hear from Dr. Sims about his book and hopefully get a little bit of a chapter by chapter overview, his story about becoming a Christian. So I'm very excited to talk about all these subjects today. Let me introduce my friend and guest. So Dr. Matthew Sims teaches humanities courses at St. Petersburg College on the Tarpon Springs campus. As far as his educational background is concerned, he has a PhD in humanities from Florida State University, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation on a comparative study between Shakespeare and Greek tragedy. Dr. Sims has a MA in English and a BA in English literature. And in 2008, he was the recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the University of Michigan, which focused on the ancient Greek poet Homer, who I'm sure we'll be hearing about today. He has also been the participant at the Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C. He's presented papers at various academic conferences, including Yale University, the University of North Carolina, University of Missouri, and other academic institutions. Dr. Sims's primary areas of interest are Homer, Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, 19th century literature, especially Dickens, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky. He's also a lover of classical music. Mozart is his favorite. All right, thanks again, Matt, for coming on the show today.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I always ask people. I know you've supported the show, and hopefully some of our colleagues at SPC will get them starting to follow you and come on here as well. The show is from a Christian perspective, of course, but I'm hoping to get as many different perspectives on the show as I can. But when I do have Christians on the show, which has really been, I think, just about everybody so far, I always like to ask people their story of how they came to faith, if you feel comfortable talking about that. And any authors, Lewis, anybody help you in grasping the essentials of the Christian faith? Why don't you just speak to that for a few minutes, and we'll go from
Sure.
there.
I don't really have what you might call a radical conversion story. Both my parents were very strong Christians, grew up in a Christian house, came from a family tradition of Christians. That's, of course, not to say I was born into it, because no one's born into Christianity, but I had a really strong background, with family. And I don't remember exactly the precise moment. I do remember when I was fairly young, maybe 4 or 5, telling my parents I had accepted Jesus as my savior. I read actually quite a bit of, well, read some Lewis. When I was as a young kid, I loved the Narnia stories. Of course, back then I had no idea. I thought it was just a good adventure story. Really, it's really hard for me to just sort of point to a specific place and time.
Oh, sure.
But I know the Lord has been with me, and so He's kept me from a lot of things, which I think is a good testimony as well. So,
Oh, absolutely. I think I've told you this before, but I can kind of relate because what was it? A couple of years back on the Gibbs campus, it was the InterVarsity Club, or one of the Christian clubs. They had asked me, one of the representatives had asked me to come and kind of tell my story, and it had been a long time since I had been asked that. And I remember getting out one of my journals and kind of spreading it landscape mode, if you will, and doing almost like a chart and trying to keep everything straight. And you know, I kind of came to the same conclusion after drawing it all out, mapping it out, that I didn't have a single moment. And you know, that seems to be a trend. And I know some Christians, even myself, maybe are a little critical of this expectation that we have this, you know, pillar of light moment, dramatic conversion on the spot, a Bible falls from heaven, if you will, and you know, poetry allowed there. You know what I mean? So I can relate. My conversion was gradual and even, you know, sometimes unassuming, not knowing what was going on. So I can relate. I understand.
Right.
Yeah.
I heard a quote from Calvin one time who said, "We are converted in stages," and I thought that made a lot of sense. You know,
Oh, I never heard that.
sometimes it's not a radical moment. It's not a radical pivotal moment of time, but it's stages. You know, that you kind of go through in your life. So
I think that's more true to, you know, our existential day-to-day experience, and certainly as Christians, we're not walking around in a trance every day. We have to kind of renew our commitment to the covenant every day, and it
right.
requires the good work of our own willpower, but also friends surrounding us, family, you know. So I think I've never heard that from Calvin, but that sounds about right.
I'm not a Calvinist, by the way, but just I thought it was a great quote.
Well, yeah, if you were, I'd have to have you get off. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. No, you know, I did an interview about my book over the holidays, over Christmas break with a Calvinist. That was kind of my first real professional run-in with a Calvinist that knew his stuff. I'm not either. I guess I'm more of a Molinist myself. But anyway, yeah, I like to have everybody from different viewpoints on the show. So anyway, that's great. So from here, I mean, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about your story, any significant moments that, you know, you feel like you need to highlight, but I figure we give a go, start talking about your book.
Okay.
So again, give us the title, and then we'll maybe just start with kind of how you came to write it and, you know, why. I think that's the first thing people want to hear.
Okay. So once again, the title is called Ancient Greeks on the Human Condition. And I'm reading off the thing here, but
yeah,
themes in the writings of Homer, Aristophanes, Euripides, and Thucydides. And really where this book started from, honestly, was in graduate school when I was at Florida State, my first semester. And the professor who turned out to be my dissertation director, Dr. Leon Golden, was very instrumental. He really emphasized the human condition. And he loved Homer, did a lot of work on Homer's Iliad, and it had a big impact on me. So every semester that I teach HUM 2210, I always teach the Iliad, and I kind of go back to some of those same principles that I learned in graduate school. So Dr. Golden was very instrumental in getting me to think about the idea of the human condition. Would you like me to kind of go through the book kind of chapter by chapter?
If you're comfortable with that, that'd be great. You know, I know that approach has worked with me when I've done mine, and I think it's a good way to go. Give us a taste of some things. I might, if you don't mind, maybe punctuate with some questions. And one thing I just wanted to pause before you begin on this chapter overview. I have been attracted to reading Homer again for some reason. The older I get, the more I feel that it is really his works are a great reflection on the human condition. And as Christians, I think there's much we can learn about various things, especially the role of anger, you know, which is that very first word, maiming, right, in Greek, rage.
Wrath, right.
Yeah,
wrath, rage, right.
Yeah, I love it. And I think there's a lot of material we can reflect on about the human condition. And also not just from a Christian point of view, but I mean, the pagan point of view has its own merits and beauty to mine from these authors. I will say I'm a blank slate with Thucydides. I know he's one of the two great historians of the 5th century, but you'll have to really help me there.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to it. Go ahead and take it away. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, well, first of all, the audience for this book, I tried to gear this toward a general reader. I don't use academic jargon much at all. You know, I try to gear it toward the person who just has an interest in the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And kind of go from there. So I think it's a very readable, sort of approachable book in that sense. It's not loaded down with postmodernism jargon, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So the first chapter is basically I talk about the human condition. What is the human condition? Which is really the theme of the book. But how do we understand the human condition throughout history, through the humanities, art, literature, music, philosophy, religion? How do these all point toward the human condition? And that's kind of the first book. It kind of sets up the importance of the human condition. The second chapter, I really kind of focus more on the ancient Greeks themselves and talk about what was the legacy of the ancient Greeks. I start off with a quote from Percy Shelley, who said, "We are all Greeks." And so the idea that we're all sort of, whether we realize it or not, we are, where there's so much influence that we get from the ancient Greeks, whether it's democracy, sports, different things like that. So I talk about the Greek influence in the second chapter. The third chapter, I talk about the four views of the human condition, which is the heroic, the tragic, the comic, and the absurd. And for each of those four, I have a different author.
Okay.
Do I kind of focus on that?
I have to, if you don't mind, for the absurd, do you use Camus?
I reference Camus. I do. I sure do. I sure do. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the existentialists. I don't agree with all their philosophy, but there's some great material.
Oh, there. Yes. I talk about Camus, sort of as a 20th century version of the absurd.
Yeah.
So you're right on.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, that's fine. So the third chapter, I talk about the four, and I kind of explain what each of those means. I don't know if you'd want me to go into that in detail here or not.
I actually, if you don't mind, I would love to hear it. I'm particularly interested in the tragic view, because this is something I've struggled, as you know, we teach similar classes, if not always the same classes. I say, okay, tragedy means goat song, right? Oidos, song, tragos. So, okay, what does that tell us? Something about the prize that the tragedians and comedians were awarded, but it's a honor the god Dionysus. But tragedy, in English, it conjures up grief and sadness.
Yes.
What is it? You have heroic first. So go ahead and break each of those down. Sure.
Okay. Well, the heroic, I use Homer as an example. The Iliad is the proof, is the text for this. But the heroic is essentially the Greek concept that the most important thing in life is kleos, the Greek word for glory, immortality. That the only way to cheat life of its death, which is imminent, is to do something that will survive us. So our names will be remembered. Right? Hence Achilles, right? He's going to be remembered for thousands of years.
Sure.
The tragic, which I use Thucydides for this, is there's so many, like you said, there's tragedy has been equated. When there's a plane crash, everybody says it's tragic, or a car wreck, it's tragic. It's become synonymous with sadness, but
exactly
that's not specifically just what it meant for the ancient Greeks, especially Aristotle. But it's the way I look at tragedy. It's the reversal of fortune, going from good to bad. And of course, we see this all the time, don't we?
Oh yeah.
Wow,
that's profound.
The reversal of fortune, and whether it's an intellectual mistake. The Greek term is homatia, missing the mark.
Familiar with
which actually the New Testament is the word for sin. That's where they got the word for sin, is you have fallen short, you have missed the mark. And so that's really kind of a tragic flaw. Of course, the Greeks didn't really have a concept of original sin, but
no.
They still knew something was wrong, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So that's kind of the reversal of fortune from good to bad. And the third one is the comic, which is, we all like to laugh. We are the only creatures that have a sense of humor, as far as I know. And so we understand irony. I love what I think it was Henri Bergson that said something about, we never laugh at landscapes, we never laugh at a waterfall, because there's nothing intrinsically comic about it, right? Something has to be human for it to be comic. That's why we laugh at animals sometimes, because they resemble humans, right?
Wow. Yeah.
But nobody laughs at the Grand Canyon. There's nothing comic about it.
Yeah, that's profound.
And so that's kind of, that's one of the, and usually the comic is making fun of something ridiculous or foolish.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of grist for the mill for that one, right?
Oh, absolutely. So Can I just ask a question? The Greek word for comedy, I can't remember what exactly it means. What's the literal, I guess, definition? Do you remember?
I'm trying to remember. Now, I have to be honest with you. I don't know Greek. I don't know the language,
Yeah,
the
that's
Greek
okay.
language. So I have to be honest there.
No, no, no problem.
I know that the way that Aristotle defined comedy
Yeah, yeah.
is it's a depiction of people who are base, people
Okay.
who are beneath the norm.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
Whereas tragedy is actually an affirmation. Tragedy shows people who are above the norm.
Hmm.
Comedy depicts people beneath the norm. When I teach my classes, I always use the example of, Archie Bunker.
Hmm.
Everybody laughs at him, but
Hmm.
you don't want to be like him exactly. Or
True.
and then I use an example of tragedy. I don't know if anybody's seen this film in my class or not, but William Wallace in Braveheart was,
Hmm.
you admire him, you would like to think that you could be like him, but of course he has
Sure.
a very sad ending. But it's better to be like William Wallace than to be like, Archie Bunker or George Costanza, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I have to use these modern examples, for
Those are
students, and
those are great. No, no, that
yeah,
that makes it crystal clear. I can't remember if it has something to do with the satyr plays. I know that was kind of related to it. The phallic
yes,
plays maybe has something to do with that, and that's okay. We can move on. But this is very helpful because see the idea of reversal for tragedy is something that was kind of an epiphany for me hearing that,
mhm,
and it made me think actually of Tolkien's concept. I don't know if you're familiar with the eucatastrophe that he talks about. Eucatastrophe was a word that Tolkien coined, and it refers to kind of a something sad but that has this good final kind of turn. It has an ultimately positive effect, kind of the
okay,
resolution, opposite of the discatastrophe, which is what we normally think of when we think of catastrophe. And it
okay.
just made me think that fits there for your definition of tragedy.
And let me, if I could just add for just a minute here,
Sure.
there's so many different variants of tragedy. There is,
Mm.
if you've ever read Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman, he's actually maybe a little more pathetic than tragic, right? He
Oh,
he
absolutely.
doesn't he doesn't have that tragic noble stature
Mm.
that, let's say, an Oedipus has, or
Agreed completely.
according to Aristotle.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
Okay, well, good. So we've got heroic from Homer. We've got the tragic, you said, Thucydides, but also Euripides and Aeschylus, Sophocles, and then the comedic is primarily Aristophanes. This is kind of matching up with the title of your book, and
Right.
then the absurd is the last one, right?
Right. The absurd, I use Euripides because even though he
Oh,
wrote tragedies, in some ways he almost, well, I don't want to say it too strongly, but some people
no,
think he
please.
actually destroyed tragedy, or his was sort of an anti-tragic,
Yeah,
because he takes these heroic figures from Homer and from other Greek writers, and he really kind of deflates them. He
yeah,
really makes them look like adolescents.
yeah.
So he
That's
takes away all these
cool.
heroic pretensions
Mm,
and makes them look ridiculous.
yeah, I agree. I agree. Thinking of the Iphigenia at Aulis play,
Mhm.
which is particularly insightful. And no, I'm thinking that was a Sophocles play. I'm thinking of Ajax, but that was Sophocles. So yeah, I'm interested. I guess the one I'm really piqued about is not only tragic, but to talk a little bit more about absurd. So what is it about the writing and performances of Euripides that really where you found this, you discovered this?
Yes, well, actually, in my dissertation, which has been 21 years ago now,
Yeah. Oh man.
we get
Yeah.
old quick, don't we?
Yeah. Absolutely.
In my dissertation, I compared Euripides and Shakespeare, and if you don't
Wow.
mind,
Yeah.
I was very influenced by a scholar named E.R. Dodds. He was a
Hmm.
Oxford professor,
Yeah.
and he wrote an article. This is back in the 30s, I think, but it's
Mm.
called Euripides the Irrationalist,
Huh.
and actually it's 1929. It's quite old,
Okay.
but he makes the argument that Euripides really disagreed with the Socratic assumption,
Mm.
Platonic assumption, that reason was the means of salvation. Reason was the way to truth. Reason, that Plato and Socrates had put reason on such a high pedestal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what Euripides does, and I think in this way he's closer to the Christian story than Plato or Socrates in this respect,
Mm.
is that reason, that there's a kind of moral impotence to reason. In other words, reason might be able to judge our actions, but it cannot always guide our actions. Reason is insufficient to help us to do what we know we should do. The example from Euripides, of course, is Medea, who, before killing her children, I'm paraphrasing, but she makes the statement. She says, "I know that what I'm about to do is wrong. I know it's wrong, but my passion is more powerful than my reason."
Wow.
So what she's really admitting there is the same thing I think St. Paul would have said, or you find in the Bible, is that our reason, we are not primarily governed by our reason. We're really governed by our desires, our emotions.
Appetites,
Our appetites, right.
Yeah.
So
I couldn't agree more, and certainly see Euripides lampooning Logos in his plays, and know he was more of a kind of attracted to the sophist movement. One thinks of Protagoras of Abdera. Trying to think of Gorgias was another famous sophist that was I think he admired these ideas, and there's some validity to, I think, this point of view, and that Logos is a powerful tool. It allows us to judge what's true from false, but sometimes it can be devoid of meaning if we just use it in and of itself. I heard one author describe, if we just rely on reason, that's like a tree floating in midair. It has to have a root system. It has to be anchored in something else. And so certainly I think, to the exclusion of other parts of the mind, can be a very dangerous weapon. And I think that's what he was trying to expose.
Yes, even Aristophanes, right? If you've read the
little bit
the Clouds, where you remember where the Strepsiades' son is trying to rationalize his way into beating up his own parents. And he kind of uses this idea that all these laws we have are they're made by man, therefore they can be changed by man. So he's using a kind of moral relativism, trying to justify beating up his own parents, which we know is wrong.
Of course.
Like, we know that intrinsically, right? But if we're simply depending upon reason, I mean, look at the Nazis, right? They were very rational in their methods.
People don't give them enough credit for that.
Yeah, and look what they did, though. I know. So it's reason by itself. You can rationalize anything.
Absolutely. Yeah, Medea is a great example, as I'm thinking. So she poisons was it the bride to be? Jason's bride to be, and kills Jason's father. Is that right?
She poisons the fiance and kills her own children.
Right. More importantly, I mean, of course, all life is precious. I don't mean it that way. That came out wrong. But yeah, the one shudders at the thought of any of them, but killing her own children really, I think, is the most tragic element of that play.
Open up a newspaper and you'll see the same thing happening today, right? The human condition hasn't changed, has it?
No, it really hasn't. And that's why I think these works still speak to us. And I think some have said that Euripides might be the most tragic, but are you agreeing with that, or?
Well, I hate to disagree with Aristotle.
No, disagree. Go for it.
But Aristotle said that in the Poetics. He said that Euripides was the most tragic, but it depends on how you define tragic. If you define tragic as a noble figure whose downfall is caused by an intellectual mistake, such as Oedipus.
Sure.
Yeah, that becomes problematic, because I think what Euripides is doing is he's taking these classical tragedy and he's kind of doing what Nietzsche did to ethics. He's really trying to break away from the whole tradition. And so once again, it depends on how one defines tragic, but I actually see him as anti-tragic.
Yeah, I think that's a really appealing position to take, and I'm not an expert, but I'm beginning to see that I think you have a strong point there. And yeah, Nietzsche spoke of philosophizing with a hammer. So maybe Euripides was doing this to tragedy, and maybe it's good because he was questioning the assumptions that had kind of were established probably by Aeschylus and Sophocles. So I'm intrigued. Yeah, this is a subject that's very close to my heart, because I've always been a fan of, especially Aeschylus has been one of my favorite playwrights. So I'm very excited to read this book. I'm not sure if we left anything out on absurd, but if you want to
Yeah. Let me just add this. The absurd is
Sure.
really, I don't know if I said this previously, but it's kind of a refutation of the belief that we live in a rational universe, right?
Okay.
You
Yeah.
mentioned Camus earlier,
Yeah.
and, Camus, there was that quote, I'm paraphrasing, but Camus said, the idea of absurdity can strike anybody in the face at any street corner.
Mm.
And if you really think about life, certain things strike us as absurd. They don't seem to be rational.
Mhm.
Of course, as Christians, we know that there is a plan, there is a God who is in control, there is a divinity.
Yes.
But if you take away, see what the Greeks did not have, they did not have that assurance.
No.
And I think we have to be a little mindful, of Euripides. It's not like people will say he was an atheist, but my goodness, I think I'd almost rather be an atheist in his day than believe in these gods, right?
Amen to that. I was just about to go there. Yes. Very, very true.
It's
Yeah.
not like he had the Bible as a third choice here. I mean, he was
No.
living centuries before Christianity, living as a
Mhm.
Greek pagan.
Mhm.
And so it's like, where do you turn to in the absence of Christianity,
Well,
right?
certainly, and that maybe we'll definitely come back to this subject again because I'm interested in picking your thoughts about salvation prior to Christ. And I've always thought, I know this gets into some rocky territory, but I've always thought it's unfair to judge a person on a truth they could not have possibly known, and unloving, and more importantly, unjust. I think, well, both are important, but no, Euripides or Homer or Aeschylus, they had no alternatives. And yes, the Jews were around, but there was at that time no interaction yet, really significant interaction until the fourth century, really, with the Jewish people via Alexander. So I think it's important for Christians to think about this, and we shouldn't be like, oh, poor Greeks, they didn't have this. But at the same time, I think it's worth a closer look to kind of say, how is God viewing these people who are really lacking that essential component? So
Right.
we'll come back to it towards the end if you like.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right, and the idea that Camus, we expect to find meaning in life, and yet life doesn't give it to us, and that's the absurd.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gone through heroic, tragic, comedic, absurd, and that was chapter 3, right?
Yes, that was
Okay.
chapter 3 is where I kind of outline each of those and kind of what they mean. Now
Okay.
what I do in the next 4 chapters is I talk about the heroic in terms of the Iliad.
Mm-hmm.
And then in chapter 5, I talk about the tragic in terms of the Peloponnesian War, which was written by
Mm-hmm.
Thucydides, and how Athens was guilty of hubris and they had a reversal of fortune, defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. The invasion of Sicily, for example, was a terrible mistake. It was hubris. It was almost like it was something out of Macbeth,
Mm-hmm.
And then the next chapter is, I guess that would be 4 or 5. I guess chapter 6 deals with Aristophanes, or excuse me, chapter 6 is Euripides
Okay.
and the absurd. And I use 2 plays. I use the Iphigenia in Aulis and the Bacchae
Oh,
by
wow.
Euripides as the 2
Okay.
plays there.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about how those demonstrate the absurd.
Mm-hmm.
The 7th chapter is Aristophanes, and I talk about the comic, the folly, sometimes the ridiculousness of the human condition, how we're able to laugh at that, and which is a redeeming thing, right? Imagine if we
Yeah.
had no sense of humor.
Oh God, I don't want to.
And so I use the Clouds and the Lysistrata
Mm-hmm.
is the
Oh
2
God,
plays for that.
that's a great play. Yeah, the women refuse sex to their husbands right until they cease the fighting. Is that the one?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of I'm using this term out of proper time context, but a lot of Freudian slips.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if Freud ever read that play or not, but he
I'm not
must have.
sure. I feel like he had to have. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good one. Okay.
and which, by the way, got popular during Vietnam.
Oh,
Make love not war. That was kind of the rally.
makes sense.
Kind of
Yeah.
had a renaissance in the 60s. But
Hmm.
the last chapter, chapter 8, I try to kind of basically what I do there is I try to show how these 4 Greek views of the human condition can be extended throughout the humanities, right? So this is not just a Greek phenomenon. It's
Sure.
you find the heroic, for example, in the music of Beethoven. You find the absurd in you mentioned before the writing of Camus.
Mm-hmm.
You find comedy throughout Shakespeare, Bernard Shaw, modern TV sitcoms, and the heroic. Well, I'm sorry, the tragic is still with us, and
Certainly.
Music. There's certain pieces by Mozart have a very tragic quality to them. I talk about comedy in classical music of all places.
Really?
Haydn. Yeah, Joseph Haydn had a sense of
Mm.
humor, and he would play jokes with his audience
Huh.
in his symphonies.
Yeah,
And
I didn't know that.
yeah, so there's the comic that intrudes. It's like in Shakespeare where you have a really dark tragedy and you have these brief moments of comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Macbeth or Hamlet, and so we can't keep comedy out completely. It always works its way
Sure.
back in.
I've heard of the tragio comic, or I think that's like a hyphenated word. I've seen it in some academic works, and I've always thought, and I'm trying to remember where I heard this, but there's the old story about the two Greek philosophers, one that left his house weeping every day and one that left his house laughing. Have you ever heard about that?
I haven't heard that one.
Okay, I feel like it was N.T. Wright or somebody I've heard refer to this old image or adage. I'm not sure exactly how it started, but it was two from the ancient Greek world, and anyway, it just came to mind for some reason here. But what I'm very interested in that last chapter, especially about exploring how these themes manifest themselves in the arts, especially music, because that's such an area of ignorance for me. I'm an appreciator, of course, of music, and sorry to admit this to my audience. But I only recently discovered the Beatles, because growing up, I know that's terrible. I mean, even if you don't like them, just to not be familiar with any of their songs.
They broke up a year before I was born, so don't feel bad.
So it's like, have you ever seen this movie? Have you ever listened to this? Like, my father-in-law would always give me a hard time about it. I love him for it. It's like, you never seen Cool Hand Luke? And I said, no, I don't even know this movie existed.
Great
You
movie.
ever? Yeah, it is. Now that I've seen it, Led Zeppelin. I'm like, who's that? He's like, oh man, and then it's the same thing with the classics, and Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. I've come to very late in life, so I'm particularly looking forward to hearing about those four themes in music. So that sounds
Great.
great. I was just listening yesterday to the Requiem in D minor by Mozart. I don't
That's
know what got
beautiful.
me. Yeah, it really is, and I think it's because I was reading a book. That's what it was. I was reading a book by a new friend I've just made here. His name is John Carswell. He's written a book on the Beren and Luthien story in Tolkien's mythology, and he mentioned it. And I thought, I think I have that. And I started listening to it. I'm like, I can see why Matthew appreciates this and why he does. And I just wish I had come to these compositions sooner in life. So
That was his last work, incidentally, which he never finished.
that one was
the Requiem. Yes.
oh,
He died when he was 35. It's
Yes, I had
amazing.
heard that. Yeah. Prodigious talent, and know very little about him, but what little I know, it's incredible. What a short-lived.
Well, his father, Leopold, referred to his son, whenever I teach music, the reason I always talk about this is his father referred to his son as, quote, the miracle God let be born in Salzburg.
Wow.
So,
Sounds about right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. I have students, I'm sure they've asked you this too, but they're like, how is it that, Raphael would take peeks at the Sistine Chapel ceiling as he's painting in the Vatican libraries, the School of Athens, and how do these two giants of visual arts be born in and around the same time? And then you've got, philosophers and architects, and you think of all these great people, and it just makes one wonder about providence and God placing people into history at certain times. I know we're going to get to that towards the end, but anyway, I've always found there's a reason for that,
Mm-hmm.
certainly. So, okay, so we've gotten a chapter by chapter overview. I'm excited to read it. I was just looking at my Kindle library because I've been downloading books I've archived on the Greek tragedians, and so you've got me whipped up into a frenzy of interest. Again, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm not sure, I know you and I've privately talked about myth and how it relates and intersects with our Christian worldview and the misunderstandings. Maybe we'll start a conversation about that. And then I also want to hear if you have any opinions. So myth in general, I guess, is the first thing. And you can speak as a Christian as well. Then mythos, the term mythos for the Greeks. How do you think the Greeks viewed myth? And maybe let's speak to that for a little while.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just be honest. I'm not an expert on myth, so I don't want to pretend that I am. I've read some myth. My understanding of myth is primarily Greek myth, and I always understood myth. You can tell me if this is wrong or not, but it was something that the Greeks believed in, which was an attempt to explain something which was otherwise unexplainable, inexplicable. I don't know if that's a proper definition, but
no, I think it's a fine definition.
One of the things I found interesting, we were talking about Euripides a few minutes ago, is, and of course, Homer, my goodness, the whole mythic tradition. I think Aeschylus was it that said that Greek tragedy is nothing more than crumbs from Homer's banquet, I think is how he said it, right?
Yep.
And so, the Homeric myth. Can I add something real quick about Homer, just to,
I'd love
for the
to
listeners might find this interesting, but you know how when you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, there's 24 books in each book. And of course, we know that Homer did not do that himself, just like the Bible was done, how they did chapters later with the Bible. But the reason there were 24 chapters, I did not know this till I went to a conference, but is, there's 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, right? And the scholars at Alexandria around the 3rd century BC, when they were taking the scrolls of Homer, what they were really saying was, when they divided this into 24 books for both Odyssey and Iliad, was Homer is the beginning and the end. He is the Alpha and the Omega, right? The Greek alphabet, Alpha through Omega. And so, there's 24 books because Homer is the Alpha and Omega. That's kind of how they saw Homer.
I had no idea that was the significance of that whatsoever. That's a really great fun fact.
Right.
Profound. Yeah. Huh.
Just to show you how important Homer was to the Greeks.
Yeah. Well, and of course, we know Alexander the Great. I don't know if I ever told you, I did my undergraduate honors thesis at UCF on Alexander. And
yes,
the first things I remember, of course, for those of you that don't know, I know Matthew knows this, but Aristotle was for 3 years from the ages, I think of, I want to say it was between 13 and 16 or 10 and 13. I can't recall, one of the two. For 3 years, Aristotle was Alexander's tutor. Right. And I got a chance to go to northern Greece, the region of Macedonia, and see that, where Aristotle taught Alexander, and to go to Pella, and it's fascinating. But I remember being delighted to read the Greek and Roman historians that wrote about Alexander say that he slept with a copy annotated by Aristotle of the Iliad under his pillow in a casket, along with a dagger.
Right. Those were his two things, dagger and the Iliad.
Me too. If you check my bed. Yeah, right. So, obviously this tells us a lot about Alexander's personality.
Right.
Thankful that he didn't take Aristotle's advice in treating barbarians like plants and animals, which is apparently what he told him. Did have more of a cosmopolitan view, but a lot went wrong with that. Alexander was far from perfect. And but what I love is how seriously, this is another reason I brought this up, since you brought up Homer too, and the significance. Obviously it says a great deal of how Alexander saw Homer, but how the Greeks saw the myths. Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian who wrote about Alexander centuries later, he said that Alexander went to try to find where Prometheus was chained. The Greeks seem to take this seriously. I don't know if you ever get this question from your students, but they always ask me, did they think they're true? And so I wonder if maybe we can speak about that. How do you answer that? Are myths true? Did the Greeks think they were true?
Well, if you read Aristophanes, you have characters swearing by the gods, just as some people swear by God's name today, by Zeus or something like that. So, of course, I wasn't there, but I kind of think that, I'm not saying everybody, of course, but I think your John Doe out there probably did believe in a Zeus. And of course they equated the gods with nature, which is something Christianity doesn't do, thankfully.
No.
But Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because students do ask that question, and quite honestly, I don't have a definitive answer to it. So
That's okay.
you know,
Yeah, no, I always like to just ask people about what their stance is on myth, obviously, because here at Mythic Mission, our goal is to try to help people understand myth, not only in relation to Christian discipleship and how it's understood today, but to understand how people in pre-modern times, to use that term, historically at least, thought of this concept. And I always tell my students that they did take it to be truth about, because truth is always about something and it's always about reality. And so, like you said, I think that there were many people, if not all, that not all, obviously, there were skeptics in ancient Greece, but that they did take it to really be explanations, as you said earlier in your definition of myth, about the way the world works. And that's really what
yes.
myth is at base, is it's a way of explaining and making sense out of the world we live in, the
It makes
unexplainable.
Yeah, look what people believe in today. My goodness,
Yeah.
all kinds of weird things. So
Oh yeah.
that's a whole different podcast. But
I know. We'll do one.
yeah. By the way, I love that quote from Chesterton. I
Yeah.
think it was Chesterton who said the problem with atheists is not that they don't believe in anything; they believe in everything. I think that was
that's
pretty accurate. But
absolutely.
One person who's really interesting is, I go back to Euripides, but he kind of takes these myths and he kind of turns them on his head. You were talking about Iphigenia and Aulis, where she was sacrificed so the Greeks could sell her Troy. And, when you read Euripides' version of it, she was actually rescued at the last moment.
That's right. Yep.
It's almost like an Abraham Isaac story.
Yeah, it is. I think maybe it was from you that I heard that insightful conclusion or inference, I guess, rather. I see typologically that definitely could be a pointer toward the Jewish story and ultimately the Christian story. Certainly seems like that, and I know that people have written about the dangers of doing this. We see parallels in everything, and I hear that side of things too. That we don't want to see in every, like I just had a scholar on a couple of weeks ago who made that case, who said, just because there's a sacrifice in a story doesn't mean that it's like Christianity. And I hear that point of view as well, but I certainly think that's a significant alteration that Euripides made, because the original version, which is from Homer, right, is that, and I think Aeschylus too writes about it, and alludes to it, is that she was killed by her own father.
Right. Her father Agamemnon was more interested in getting glory than saving his daughter's life, and
yep,
that was his value system. So
yeah, that's
a scary world, isn't it?
Oh man, yeah, it really was, and it still is. There was something else though too. I was just reminded of about Euripides. I'm sure you write about this in your book, but I know we teach our students often about Deus ex machina, that this was a device in theater that Euripides sort of pioneered. Do you think that's accurate, or can you speak to that?
Yes, he uses that, but just we have more plays, by the way, of Euripides than either Aeschylus or Sophocles. We have 7 of those two first playwrights, 7 plays each. We have about 17 or 18 of Euripides.
Crazy.
Yeah. So, but yes, he does use the Deus ex machina. He uses it in several of his plays, where at the last 5 minutes of the play, everything is magically resolved, and almost like a TV show where the last 5 minutes, everything, the crime gets solved. It's
exactly.
Except in this case, it's something that's supernatural. It's divine intervention, but
right.
Which Aristotle says not the right way to write a tragedy, but
nope. I know. Yeah. But those are the two different views, though. And I think what you're trying to point out is that, Euripides, in doing that, was trying to challenge that standard definition of tragedy. And as you said, I think turning it on its head.
Yeah, he was defying people's expectations of, because Iphigenia, some people consider her to be a hero because she's willing to die to be a sacrifice for the Trojan War. And she says, why should I, being a single woman, I'm just a single woman. What is my life worth? The irony, of course, is the whole Trojan War is fought over a single woman.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow.
And so, right. So Euripides, I mean, anybody who's intelligent in the audience could see through that, I think,
Certainly. Yeah. I think that, what's so important is that we commend to Christians today. This will be our segue to our fifth and final topic. That we commend Christians to read the pagan classics. And in fact, I had Dr. Louis Marcos on. I know you're acquainted with his work, and he wrote a new book called The Myth Became Fact, and talked about finding types and pointers to the Christian myth, the Christian worldview, from the myths of the Greeks and Romans. And if you haven't read that book, it's really superb. I know you'd like it a lot.
Sounds good.
Yeah, The Myth Made Fact. And, that's a riff off what Lewis said in his essay of the same title, Myth Became Fact, C.S. Lewis.
Right.
But I think that he had an earlier book, that's right, that's where I was going with this, called From Achilles to Christ, which I think you and I talked about.
Yes.
It's a really great book. And I'm sure you being an author of this book on the tragedians and comedians, among others, would appreciate that injunction to read these books, not only just to see them from a Christian point of view, but to see their commentary on the human condition.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in the spirit of those books by Dr. Marcos, which I know we're both fans of and appreciate his work there, why don't we start a conversation about, we know historically in the Greek context what we can glean from meeting them where they are. And we've talked about that. And I think there's obviously more to say. But now as Christians, because that's what we are, and we want to read these books and we want to see them from that sacramental point of view that we have. We want to do justice to them, of course, in their own context, but how can or should, I guess, Christians read these books? Let's start there. Do you think Christians should be reading non-Christian literature? I guess that's the first question.
Yeah, I'm not of, was it Tertullian who said, what is Athens to do with Jerusalem, I think.
Yeah.
I'm probably more like Augustine, where I think, of course, one has to put Christianity first and let that be your source and your authority. But I certainly don't think my goodness, I'd be out of a job if I just, if I was just teaching Christian stuff, because
Sure.
Most of the stuff I teach is not Christian, right?
Exactly.
The art, the literature, the music.
Yep.
But I think there's value in it. I think one of the values is it shows us what we have to be grateful for. Mm-hmm. Once again, in the absence of Christianity, what do you have? If you look at Dionysus in the Bacchae, it's pure power, right? Mm-hmm. There's a quote, I heard this quote a long time ago, and it made me think of kind of our conversation here today. I think it was John Gershner who said this, but he said, give me Nietzsche or give me Jesus. Don't give me Bertrand Russell. Right? But in other words, the Dionysus is all about power, like Nietzsche was. It's either Nietzsche or Jesus. You can't mediate between the two. The Greeks had some wonderful things. They wrote some wonderful plays. I love what Nietzsche said about the Greeks. He said they must have suffered to be so beautiful.
Yes, yes, I agree.
And there is a lot of beauty in that. But when it comes down to it, we can admire the Greeks. We can appreciate them. They have much to show us, but it's incomplete.
Yes.
For example, you take the book of Job. I think Job is in many ways like a tragedy, right? If you read the book of Job. Yeah. But yet God is redemptive. You don't have that kind of redemptive God of the Greeks.
No.
Would you mind if I read a quote from C.S. Lewis about
Homer? No, not at all. No, that's why we're here. Yeah, please.
It's a little bit long. I mean, not terribly long, but let me just. This is what C.S. Lewis said about Homer.
I've got the time.
He loved Homer, but he said this: before any event can have that significance of a profound change in the history of the world, history must have some degree of pattern, some design. The mere endless up and down, the constant aimless alterations of glory and misery, which make up the terrible phenomenon called a heroic age, admit no such design. No achievement can be permanent. Today we kill and feast, tomorrow we are killed, and our women are led away as slaves. Much has been talked of the melancholy of Virgil, but an inch beneath the bright surface of Homer, we find not melancholy but despair. It is all the more terrible because the poet takes it all for granted, makes no complaint. For Homer, it is all in the day's work.
Mm. Wow.
Coming
Which,
from Lewis,
yeah, that's
who loved the
powerful.
Greeks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and he's right, and I quite agree. I mean, it is an incomplete mythos. If we look at mythos as a narrated worldview today, which is how apologists are at base looking at what myth is, and we look at the whole corpus of Greek mythology, it is a story without an ending. And so is and I'm saying this with the most delicacy that I can, but N.T. Wright has even used the same wording. The Jewish story, as it was when we leave off with the prophets, a story in search of an ending, he says in his book, How God Became King, one of my favorite books. And again, Christianity is proposing to be a myth that completes all the other stories, all the other myths. And I guess one pushback here, and I haven't talked about this with anybody, I feel comfortable talking about it with you because I'm sure you've wrestled with this. I get so many people always asking me, and I wrote this in my book too, why does it have to be the Christian story? What about you is so special? And my first response is always, look, person, with respect, it has nothing to do with me. This is what the Bible says. These are the claims of a book and a people who have repeatedly made this claim that their story is going somewhere and that their author is the author of all stories. So first of all, it has nothing to do with me. But I guess that's the question. Why the Christian story? I had one student put it like this. Well, how come Islam can't be the story to complete all stories, or Buddhism? What makes you so special? What do you think about that?
That's a perfectly legitimate question.
Mhm.
You know, I'm not an apologist. I know there's a better answer than what I'm giving here. But I think if you examine the worldview of Christianity
Mhm.
and you understand, I love what Lewis said about um, creation. He says we live in a world that was created good, but it's fallen, and
Mhm.
spoiled goodness is the way Lewis called it, spoiled goodness.
Mhm.
So we see both the goodness of creation, but we also see the fall of creation.
Sure.
I don't think there's any other worldview, and this is from an intellectual level here, but
Yeah.
uh, intellectually speaking, there's no other worldview that makes more sense,
Mm.
that can hold the tension of the beauty of creation, the fall of creation.
Mhm.
It gives us a meaning, it gives us a reason to live, and it answers the questions of where we're from, where we're going, what are we doing,
Yep.
which other religions, such as Taoism, is even sort of non-theistic, and
Sure. Yeah.
um, always the questions I used to give my students in my class was, if we are, how can something impersonal create something personal?
Right.
Right? If you believe that the divine force is an impersonal thing and we're personal, don't you have to need? Isn't it greater to be personal than impersonal? How can something personal come from something impersonal?
That makes
It's
perfect
like
sense.
it's like a computer creating a human being.
Mhm.
So there has to be a person. There has to be a person creator
Yep.
who creates persons.
I agree.
Does
I think
that make
I heard.
sense?
No, it does, and I might have this backwards, so apologies to my audience, but the effect can't be greater than the cause, I think here. So basically, what we're saying is, it doesn't make much existential, personal sense or objective, realistic sense. So the inner or outer world to make this case that moral law came from a lack of a moral lawgiver, that it came from just nothing. It just is a brute fact. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense to say that persons with will and heart and emotions and intellect and imagination came from non-intellect, non-imagination. It doesn't make any sense. I,
Right.
I quite agree, and I think it's a pretty compelling argument. I think that was a beautiful answer, Matt. And what I remember reading in Alistair McGrath, who's another favorite author of mine, Alistair E. McGrath, he's made the case that, and this is why at Mythic Mission, we're trying to take the approach from the point of view of story, myth, that, and this is a mistake I think many apologists make today, is that we're trying to win this competition, and I'm putting that crudely, but we're trying to out argue and out prove using logos exclusively and logic and syllogisms and argumentation and propositional approaches to prove one religion is truer than the others. And I think that there's a certain degree in which we should do that at certain levels and can. And I'm not saying we should drop doing this completely. What I am saying is, I think that because Christians believe God is God and he reveals the truth to us and we discover it, we don't invent it. Based on that fact, I don't think as finite, limited creatures, we will ever be able epistemologically to prove Christianity is 100% true. That's God's job, and he's done it. So the Christian isn't claiming we as Christians think that ours is the true story that makes sense of all stories because we think so. We're taking something that's been given to us and saying, this is what this outside force outside myself has revealed to me. This makes sense based on the evidence, and here it is. And so I think with that logic, what we should be trying to do perhaps is tell a better story and not be so worried about winning the argument, but telling a more compelling story. And you kind of hinted at that in what you said about making sense of things. And I think that's what we should be focusing our attention on.
Yes, the whole, you know, trying to prove 5 proofs of God's existence, Aquinas and all that stuff. Yeah. I notice my students don't find that very compelling, when I teach it. And I think they probably find Pascal more thoughtful, the Pensées.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Pensées are beautiful. And what did Pascal say? Something along these lines in one of the Pensées. He said, God has given people enough evidence for some people to find him and left out enough for others to not, so that, there's that perfect calibration between those who are seeking him will find him and those that aren't won't, and until they want to, and I thought it was just such a pithy thing to say. And that's probably why students are attracted, because that's more existentially relevant. Perhaps
people see what they're predisposed to see. I think that's undeniable.
I agree. I totally agree. And to say that, and this is my other objection to people saying, why does it have to be the Christian story? Well, you're assuming in that objection that there's another perspective that should be. And then if they try to deny it and say, oh, yeah, no, I don't think that, that's still a perspective that assumes that it can understand all other perspectives. So I think that's also inescapable. And that's what you mean. We have these presuppositions. We look at the world through them and we can't set them aside. And Christians are no different. It's so knowing that we're in the same boat, I think, again, it comes back to epistemologically in the same boat, how we know for our audience. I know you know that. But how can we tell a better story? How does the Christian story make sense of other stories? There's a sense of it fitting in with other stories, and how it makes sense of the data around us, not, which one is better. And certainly we're not trying to prove which group of believers are better. That's not at all what Christians are claiming. And I think I get that all the time from students. Well, if you think Christianity is the true, completely true religion, then you think you're better than everyone else. No, that doesn't logically follow.
Right. Yeah. People have, I hate to be mean, but people have forgotten how to think.
That's not mean. It's true. Yeah. I'm telling you, I know we both encounter it. The critical thinking is taking a plummet. So.
And you hear so much about critical thinking, but it's empty of any content. There's nothing to think about. It's all be your own thinker. It's a kind of sloppy thinking, I think.
Oh, I agree. Charles Taylor, I think, was the one that made a big splash in his book, A Secular Age, to talk about how we're all our own arbiters of meaning. We decide for ourselves. We have to find ourselves and look in to find ourselves. And thing is, how do you know what you're finding on the inside is objectively valid? You got to have something outside yourself that gives you a measuring stick to know about that confusing inner landscape. And we know, as Christians, the heart is deceitful above all things, and who can understand it?
I think you hit on it, Michael, is that if we don't understand our starting point, if we don't understand that we are sinful and that we are sinners, if you start off in the wrong way, you're going to end up in the wrong way. And I think that's, people who think that we're not predisposed to sin, I think that it makes things worse if you don't understand there's a problem.
Well, and what great story in the history of fiction or nonfiction, just history in general and myth, doesn't have a problem? There's always a predicament. And I know you and I both know that sin in hamartia in Greek, it doesn't just mean moral failure, but there's a failure to reflect the image of God, to be as a status that we possess, a failure to show the goodness and truth and beauty of God. There's, for our audience, there's so much more to sinning than just doing bad, but that it's at
Yes.
least what that is.
Right.
And
It's more than that, but not less than that, right?
yeah, exactly. And every worldview, every story, therefore, has a predicament, and everyone has an opinion of what's wrong with the human condition and what's wrong with the world. Well, here's
Yeah.
what our problem is: we need better education. Okay, here's what we need: more open-minded people. The problem is everybody's too close-minded, or you get a million and one different predicaments that everybody believes in one. So.
Right.
Um, I think that the Greeks, in that Lewis quote you read, seeing the despair it gives us kind of a hypothetical vision of reality, kind of like the author of Ecclesiastes reminds me of the Greek tragedians and the historians and comedians, that this is what the world looks like under the sun. If this is all there is, despair, and it's not all bad. There's meaning, but as Camus says, when death closes that door, it's it.
Right.
So I don't know. Any final comments, things you want to talk about?
Well, I think maybe I'll be brief here, but I think maybe a modern Greek might be someone like Hemingway, who found their glory in very, manly pursuits, hunting and fishing and all these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, there was a despair that he was not able to transcend. So I think maybe Hemingway is kind of a modern Greek. He's living for glory, but it's kind of a sad ending.
Yes, I quite agree.
And I won't take long with this, but if you think about what Christianity does, it takes the focal point away from man toward God. You're not living for your personal glory, right? You're living for the glory of God. It's what Augustine talks about: city of God, city of man. The Greeks were all about the city of man, putting themselves on the pedestal, and Christianity has a very different story,
certainly,
about where we fit into the grand scheme of things, I think.
Well, I agree. And, man is the measure of all things that are and things that are not. The Protagoras, his famous 5th century secular humanist manifesto. I mean, that's what it's all about. And as you mentioned, Augustine in the City of Man, our lives are a means to an end to serve God's glory, not our own.
Right.
And the Greek view was different, but in light of what they had available to them, and this is, it came up in an interview recently we did, where many Christians I've spoken to said, well, they had enough general revelation to know better. I don't know where I stand on that. I know what Romans 1-3 talks about this. I think that, yes, they had quite a bit to go on to know about the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. Kind of coming back just for our final point, what the Greeks, where I'm going with this is that, yeah, they had access to general revelation, but I don't know that it was enough to really give them that alternative we were referring to earlier.
You mean the Greeks had general revelation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And any thoughts on that?
Once again, I'm not an apologist, so I want to tread carefully here, but I think general revelation can take you in different directions as well. I think it mostly points to God, but there's a lot of things in our natural, world that we live in that are, parasites, bacteria, cancer. There's a lot of things that are also very negative. You have the beauty and you have the tragedy. So I don't think general revelation, and here's where I agree with Dante, I don't think general revelation is sufficient. I think it's a starting point, but it's not an ending point.
Yes, I agree. And that's certainly true. So it's interesting to kind of leave our listeners with that thought today, about the Greeks. And I know that we're all trying to be fair and think about, from the Christian point of view, as far as salvation is concerned. And you mentioned Dante, and his virtuous pagans. We try to think, okay, well, they had general revelation, but where are they? Have they been confined to hell? Are they in some sort of purgatory / limbo? Will they have a chance to enter heaven because of where they and when they were born? And this is something I want to explore on Mythic Mission again. Maybe it's a future podcast for us to put our heads together about. But very interesting. And I want to hear about some of your other literary interests. Maybe we'll have you on again to talk Shakespeare. I didn't get to
Oh,
ask
that'd
you
be
about
great.
that. Yeah, because I know that's a part of your area of expertise. Real quick,
Let
what
me
was
say,
your,
Michael, I've listened to these podcasts and they're really excellent. So all the listeners out there, this is really, there's, especially the guy you had last time. I loved his view of Plato. It was just very, very stimulating. So
Thank you, man. I'm happy to have a good friend on the show today with me, and I have to ask you. I appreciate what you said. Who do you have a favorite Shakespeare play?
I'm doing Macbeth right now. My goodness, that's a hard one.
I know it is. Yeah,
it'd probably have to be one of the tragedies, but probably
me too.
maybe Macbeth or Richard II is really good too. But Hamlet, I mean, probably between Hamlet and Macbeth.
I haven't read the historical plays, so the Richard II and the Henry plays. I've got to read those yet, but I've always enjoyed Midsummer Night's Dream as a comedy, and Macbeth was my all-time favorite in undergrad. I always was attracted to the Scottish play, as they call it. So,
and I'll shout out for Troilus and Cressida because that doesn't get a lot of publicity, but that's a good play too.
No, I've heard of it, yeah, but haven't read it. So, yeah. Well, good. Okay. Well, again, thank you everybody for listening, and thank you, Matthew, for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Michael.